So most of you in the room, in various guises, will either have a loved one, have a friend, know somebody, a colleague, etc., or in fact yourself, potentially, will absolutely be petrified of flying. Now, on that basis is that you have a look at the top fears and top risks and top understandings, but actually in reality is that most people assess risk in a very, very different way. Some people assess it completely, but actually in reality, for most of you, for those friends, for those loved ones, it can be white knuckles into the chair, it can be this complete irrationality, it can be whether they're drugging themselves up on the flight on the way to the holiday or something like that. But really, unfortunately, the old adage is, and again you've heard it many, many times before, is that human beings, from that point of view, it's much more likely you die horribly on the way to the airport than ever up in the air. Now, at that point, you don't get to the airport and then go, oh, thank God the dangerous part of my journey is over, let's get on this nice, safe plane. Now, from that perspective, is that on that idea of the risk and understanding of the idea of the risk, and for the last 9 or 10 years, I've expanded and looked into much more the academic side and the research of how people perceive risk. And again, after 10 years, I don't know how humanity got this far, but generally speaking, it's that perspective of actually it's very emotional charge. Now, in these sorts of cases, is that if you then switch from air travel to, for instance, a car crash on the M25, for instance, is that you have a really good image in your head that represents the problem in relation to the air crash. Thank 1990s and 2000s action movies, thank terrorism and all these sorts of things as well that impacts it. This media sensationalism that surrounds it. But actually in reality is that what you have an understanding, a very emotional and visceral sense of what could happen to you going at several hundred miles an hour in a steel and aluminium tube. But the problem is, when do you associate the risk of the car crash? Now, most people will get in the car or they drive here, drive to the conference, they never realized or understood the risk. But really the car crash is only an emotional problem, or it's not even an emotional problem or a motivational problem until it is. So when do you go to the car and associate the risk with the car? When you've just been involved in a car crash. Now, on that basis, if I then switch to things like crime and risk and other types of crime, is if I say terrorism, everybody in this room has an image in their head that represents the problem almost immediately. Whether it's 7/7, whether it's Manchester, whether it's 9/11, whether it's, again, Israel, or whatever the context that comes to mind, it is often a very visceral and emotional imagery that really comes to mind quite quickly. But what happens if I say fraud? What happens if I say cyber? What happens if I say scams? Disinformation? What's the image that comes to mind, especially around fraud? Now, the problem is, for most of you, there really isn't an image. Now, when it comes to it, now I specialize in the behavioral science around online-enabled crime, online facilitated social engineering, and all these sorts of things. And what this is actually called is the availability heuristic. And in English, is that human beings assess the probability or the assessment of something based on the ease of which information comes to mind. So again, air travel, air crash, media sensationalism, you have an image in a very emotional, visceral sense almost immediately. Problem is, much less likely that it would happen to a car crash, but the pile-up on the M25 does not always make good news, nor does it make a particularly interesting Fast and the Furious film. So the fact is, it doesn't conjure an idea, it doesn't conjure an emotional concept. And the same with fraud, the same with a lot of these risks that we have that expose us to different elements of society, is that the whole principle around that and the idea around risk, and again, it's like kind of talking to security leaders in this field and assessing that element of risk, but you know what this is in practice. It's what we call probability neglect. People are often scared of things that they don't actually, from a probability point of view, have less likelihood to happen, but they're not scared of things that are more likely to happen. I.e., again, for me, I do a lot of the public education, a lot of the TV stuff, a lot of the engagement, and actually trying to push that wet noodle up a hill to try and convince you that fraud and scams is something that you should be motivated to educate yourself against. The problem is there isn't any motivation because I wouldn't fall for it. I wouldn't fall for that scam. I wouldn't fall for that phishing email that came through. I wouldn't fall for that romance scam or investment scam or whatever flavor of scam or fraud or social engineering. The problem is when it comes to social engineering in these sort of aspects, is that every single person in this room, without fail, has been told something that you wanted to hear at probably the wrong time you should have heard it. Whether that's the last marriage you had, the last relationship, whatever the last job you had, etc. Human beings, we are experts at telling ourselves a story, i.e. lying to ourselves in various guises, and actually that narrative really does come into play when we want to believe something. Now the problem is with this, and what my part-time research and my PhD is about, is that this relationship with technology and the relationship we have with risk, and what I call essentially abstract risk, if you will, is that risks that are not emotional, risks that are often online enabled, that have this kind of divide where there is no imagery to really conjure any sort of emotional motivation for you. So if I'm trying to design e-learning, or if I'm designing training, or trying to implement any sort of internal cultural change or educating the public, these things are not emotional problems until they are. If you're a consultant, you know how bad it is, and like very often the topic of the panel is trying to convince people that it is something that we should invest in, whether it's emotional time or real estate or investment or money or whatever it is that that's part of the problem. Because people really, especially in this field, don't see the problem until it becomes one. And now, on the left-hand side is that I talk about what's called cognitive heuristics, so the mental shortcuts in which operate in relation to how we make decisions. Spoiler alert, very poorly, generally. But very often, I also talk about the criminal side. And this is where really the broader strokes really come into it, because from a criminal point of view, opportunity, again, if I want to burgle a house, is there an open window, or is there a door that I can potentially jimmy open, or something like that? I'm going to be an opportunistic criminal in that aspect. Capability. Do I have the strength or the dexterity to be able to climb up or to open the window, or do I have the cardio to be able to run away? Pressure. What pressure is on me, both objective and subjective, in order for me to rationalize and to take advantage of that opportunity and capability in order to commit the crime, whether it's a cyber attack, whatever it is. But from a burglary in the house, what's the pressure? It could be drugs, it could be environment, it can be I want a better sense of life. All these sorts of things that really tie into what essentially is the major factor, is the rationalization from a criminal point of view. How do I tell myself a story? Because we talk about how do criminals sleep at night? Well, actually, very well, because if they didn't, they'd be terrible criminals. So the fact is that they're able to tell themselves and rationalize a story based on those pressures and opportunities. The problem is if you overlay technology onto a lot of these different factors, say overlay technology onto opportunity, capability, pressure, and rationalization, the story in which I tell myself, actually it reduces the likelihood and the need and the barrier to entry for all four of those things. So again, when it talks about social engineering, do I have an internet connection? Yep. Capability, well, most of it's point and click in various guises. And also from a pressure point of view, if the opportunity and capability for me to enact a crime is actually lower, well, then does the pressure have to be that great? Well, no. Out of the 45 individuals rearrested from my police unit that I kind of moved over from in January, out of the 45 during COVID for large-scale national smishing campaigns, I think only 2 of which were over 18. So the fact is, the accessibility to a lot of this crime is already there. But also, because if I'm behind that technology, behind that device, well, actually the rationalization, the story in which I have to tell myself to justify my behavior, doesn't have to be that great either. But when we talk about criminals becoming more sophisticated in this space, is that if you overlay AI onto that platform, onto those 4 factors, what it essentially is essentially what as every other piece of technology has done for the last 10, 20, 30 years, is lowering the barrier to entry. It's lowering the barrier to entry and accessibility for all of us on this side of the fence, but also inadvertently and obviously also lowering the barrier to entry on the other side. Because again, I've worked a lot with Visa in the past as well, is that actually things like Japan has had like a 2,500% increase in things like social engineering. And one of the biggest considerations that they've talked about is like, well, actually, how do we measure that? How has that come about? Well, one of the big analytical kind of presumptions, if you will, is that actually getting Japanese script right in, say, for instance, a traditional translation tool was actually incredibly difficult to do. because of grammatical aspects and all these sorts of things. But actually, now with things like large language models, natural language processing, it's designed to get that grammar right and that context right. But actually, that's what's opened up that kind of almost that barrier to entry, because I don't have to be a native Japanese speaker in order to open up that opportunity. But the thing is, for me, is even over the last 9 or 10 years and working this, and I work both through UK Finance, but also I'm embedded and part funded by City of London Police, by their Economic Crime and Cyber HQ. And all of it comes down to one simple thing. Have you ever taken a text message the wrong way from a partner? Have you ever taken an email the wrong way from a colleague? Yeah? Now, the thing is that in that sort of situation, that text message from the partner, or whether they've just asked you what you want for dinner that night or something like that, actually does come down to the fact that, did you have an argument before you left the house that morning for the work? Or did you have a really lovely date night the night before? That text message, that communication, is the emotional context, or read in the emotional context of your relationship, of your emotions, how you feel about them, how they feel about you. Everything that's going on for you at that very moment is that text message. Now, the emotional context of also from that email from the colleague is whether you hate them or not, or something along those lines. So you read it in that perspective. Because the fact is that that is no different to any other element of social engineering. Any scam, any phishing email, any ability for me to manipulate you in any case, shape, or form, because actually the way in which we manipulate an individual has not changed for thousands of years, but what has changed is, in fact, obviously, the format. But from that perspective, is that, like I said before, everybody's being told something that they wanted to hear at the wrong time. You should have heard it. And when it comes down to manipulation, and when it comes down to those scams, is that we talk about, again, oh, well, if it's too good to be true, then it is. Or trust your gut, then, okay, absolutely, you can trust your gut, and if it feels fishy, it feels fishy. It's absolute garbage advice. Because A, can you tell me what too good is? Can anybody tell me what magical spreadsheet that means for that holiday scam or that phishing email that's come through to my business? Can anybody tell me what your gut instinct is? Well, actually, unfortunately, even in the best circumstances, your gut instinct or your intuition is generally quite rubbish. It's based on your subjective experience and your education up until that point. But what happens if these problems are not an emotional problem? And I've never been motivated to take on board the education. Where do I get that intuition? Well, I don't. And the problem is, and my big concern, especially in relation to AI and deepfakes and all these sorts of things, is that already human beings read what we want to read, we believe what we want to believe, and we follow what we want to follow. At no point have we ever had this level of agency in the content in which we consume, but also, because of these, we are rampantly subjective. Because actually, why do we have a mental health problem in this country, in a lot of different areas, etc., is because we are rampantly subjective. Because we read things in the way I want to read it, based on the emotional context of which we read it, and our well-being, and actually your ability to spot social engineering or any sort of manipulation fundamentally comes down to your well-being and your narrative. Because the story in which you tell yourself in any given situation. Now, I do a lot of work in consultancy and inputs around staff approaches, insider risk, fraud and scams, cryptocurrency, AI, and I do all the kind of behavioural elements to it, because it all boils down to the fact that actually if my staff is supported from a well-being point of view, but actually me being able to spot manipulation, and if you think about with AI, is that if we can assume that we will go towards more of a dystopian era, where that deep fake is completely, you cannot tell the difference between that and another video, for instance, or an image that's been created. You're already seeing, if you've got Instagram or any social media, you're already seeing the saturation of AI-created imagery as well, and we're exposed to it over time. Is that narrative and that emotional projection, because every time you click on a link, or you do anything, essentially, is that there is a need being met. Like, for instance, in romance, I do a lot of work in romance scams and romance manipulation and friend scams, investment scams, etc. Again, that part is very, very obvious in what part of you am I manipulating, whether it's loneliness and isolation or something along those lines. But the increasing element of that mixture between romance scams, engagement, reducing of isolation, and kind of almost appreciating and engaging with your mental health and what need is being met. But actually then it ties into things like insider risk, the ability for me to groom an individual. But the problem is in these sorts of situations is that because we're so saturated by content, we're so saturated by notifications and information, especially based on the relationship we have with technology, is that very often we have no feedback. We have no intervention between us and our devices. Because if I say to you, what's the difference between fraud and marketing? Is there any? Now, it's sometimes a bit of a controversial statement, especially for anybody who's in marketing. But the fact is, most of my research all comes back down to the fact that I need to use context, authority, urgency, scarcity, but more importantly, emotion. And very often, what has been a real theme of already this morning is the kind of concentration on the aspects around emotion, the concentration around that kind of element of that well-being and support as well. Because the fact is that if I want to click on a link or direct your traffic to somewhere, I want to appeal to your sense of, again, what's going on for you right at this very moment, is that all of these sorts of things and that manipulation is palpable. It's incredibly powerful. Because actually, online communication can be, especially if I'm trying to break into your organization, utilizing AI is just a filter. When it comes to social engineering, all it does is it facilitates communication. It facilitates the quality, potentially. Although from a banking industry, we have seen the testing of the waters in various guises, but it's not being as successful as we probably imagined. But we're never going to see the stats around AI crime in our field, for instance. There's not going to be a category with action fraud around AI crime. Because what AI does is it facilitates communication, therefore facilitates social engineering, therefore it's also facilitated marketing and all these sorts of things, because there's not going to be able to, if I've got Mrs. Miggins who was a victim of a scam, is she going to be able to tell me whether that email was created by AI or a ChatGPT model, or that image that was sent for that relationship that they were building, was that a deepfake or that engagement? No. So the fact is that we're not necessarily going to be able to, especially from my field, we're not necessarily going to be measuring it in the way we can do. But the problem is that what happens when the content in which we consume becomes closer to reality, especially when it's intending to manipulate us. Now, whether it is the language in which we use around social engineering and engagement, is that one of the things with fraud and scams very often, and especially social engineering, it's one of the only crime types you say you fall for. Now, the problem is, especially in internal education, I love this, like don't fall for a scam this Black Friday, or don't fall for this phishing email for a cyber attacks, etc. It's wonderful because actually that terminology creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because what I'm actually asking you to do, especially to the people who have not been a victim before, or impacted it, again, not an emotional problem until it is that what I'm actually asking you to do is say, admit to me, but more difficultly admit to yourself, that you are vulnerable to human manipulation. Of course I would fall for that scam. I will make sure that's relatable, and I will make sure I take on board that e-learning or that training. No, that doesn't happen, because we don't think we'd fall for it. Because that's me admitting to myself that I'm vulnerable. Of which, guess what? Humans aren't great at doing. If I could afford therapy for the majority of the UK population, I would. But that's not necessarily feasible. Because there's always a need being met. There is always contextual vulnerability of what is happening for that individual at home, in their mind, in their narrative, in their mental health, their distraction, their management. Everything that is going on for that very person at that very moment can all be crucial to it. Especially if I'm being approached online, staff approaches, insider risk, AI, how it's facilitating that as well, onboarding. But if I say to you, have you ever read a book that's been turned into a film? And did you agree with the casting choice? And the fact is when we say, well, probably not, because actually the author can be the most beautiful writer in the world, but you create the character around the author, the framework that the author gives you. Most people mention 50 Shades at that point in various guises, etc., or various films in various guises, but actually you create the character. You create the person. And that's no different to being groomed online. The criminal doesn't always have to do that much. Never underestimate a person's ability to conjure hope when they need it. Never underestimate a person's ability or contextual vulnerability, because everyone in this room has been told something that they wanted to hear at the wrong time. And if you take that into a framework and look at your business and looking at that idea, from an AI point of view, the education remains the same. How do you authenticate communication in the traditional way? How do you make sure that actually, from an emotional projection point of view and understanding, well, I don't see the risk. How do we make it much more of an emotional problem within our organization? What sort of language do we use, and how do we talk about fraud and scams, especially in the space of understanding the risk? How do we understand that actually from a complete subjective point of view around things like confirmation bias, like, again, we only read what we want to read, we only believe what we want to believe, and all I need to do on the other side of that device is lay a touch point. And how do we actually look at that grooming aspect when actually we're much more subjective, we're much more emotional? And then I give another touch point, whether it be an email, whether it's a phone call, whether it's grooming online, whether it's on LinkedIn, whatever it is. And the fact is that very often from a scams point of view, an intervention point of view, or even internal culture point of view, we're at the end of this process. So my call to action for all of you is to think about, instead of actually engaging the story when actually, have you ever tried to tell a person that they're in a relationship they shouldn't be in? And how difficult is that to do? Yeah, that's that end process. How do we as an organization intervene a lot sooner before that grooming and manipulation starts? And that comes down to the emotional side. So thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate your time.